Roman envoys arrived to confront Teuta, the Illyrian queen, with a blunt list of grievances. Raids at sea had been getting worse for years in the waters between Illyries and Italy. Merchant shipping was being harassed, cargoes seized, crews threatened. Now it had reached the point that Italian traders were being killed, and complaints had reached Rome in an urgent, unmistakable tone. The envoys stated their purpose plainly. Teuta was expected to restrain her people, stop the attacks, and ensure nothing like this happened again. Even here, the official words did not tell the whole story. Rome had also been asked for help by the Greek island community of Issa, and the timing of the embassy was no accident. The Roman delegation, led by the brothers Gnaeus and Lucius Coruncanius, found Teuta occupied with the siege of Issa's main town. That detail mattered. The Romans were not only seeking justice for dead merchants, they were measuring a rising power. They wanted to know whether Teuta posed a limited problem of piracy or a wider strategic threat to the entire Adriatic coastline. The atmosphere in the Queen's pavilion tightened as these meanings collided. Teuta listened without hiding her disdain. After the envoys finished speaking, there was a pause while she consulted her advisors. Then, she answered with the polished restraint expected in formal diplomacy. But the substance of her reply was an outright refusal. Rome, she said, had no right to treat this as a matter of state. She claimed she had no intention of provoking Rome officially. Yet she also insisted that Illyrian rulers did not interfere with private ventures at sea. In other words, the raids were acknowledged as normal, profitable, and not something she intended to police. It was a provocative stance, and it cut against the usual diplomatic escape routes. A more cautious response would have denied involvement, promised an investigation, offered soothing assurances, and bought time. Teuta did the opposite. She accepted the raids as part of her world and rejected the demand to curb them. Roman tact failed as well. The younger Coruncanius lost his temper, exactly what a diplomat is trained not to do. He warned the queen that if this was standard Illyrian practice, Rome might come and change those practices by force. The statement was a threat, and it revealed what the Romans had already begun to believe. After seeing the situation around Issa and hearing Teuta's position, the envoys were no longer treating her as a negotiator. They were treating her as an enemy. The meeting ended in bitterness, the promise of violence now hanging in the air. What happened next is not fully clear, but the outcome was explosive. As the delegation prepared to sail home, one or possibly both envoys were killed, along with the Issaean figure whose appeal had helped trigger the mission. Whether these deaths were ordered from above or carried out by agents acting on their own, Rome interpreted the murders as an act of war. The decision that followed would mark a turning point. Rome was about to commit to its first major overseas military venture eastward, into regions shaped by Greek language and culture. To understand why this crisis escalated so quickly, the setting matters. Illyries, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Albania and Dalmatia, had a reputation in the Greek world as a hard frontier, only partly shaped by urban life and contact with its southern neighbours. The land was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of tribes connected by a shared culture and related languages, with shifting coalitions and rival leaders. Coastal contact had created pockets of Greek-style settlement, especially in the south, but the region still functioned largely through networks of loyalty around local dynasts. At this moment, the leading tribal power was the Ardii. In the 230s, their king, Agron, had built something close to a confederacy by forging alliances with influential figures across the region. Among them were Demetrius, a Greek lord based on the wealthy island of Pharos, and Scerdylidas, leader of the Illyrian Labiatae. The structure was not an empire, but it was strong enough to act beyond its borders. Opportunity arrived in the south. Epirus, the Greek tribal confederacy along the northwestern edge of Greece, fell into internal chaos after overthrowing a monarchy that had become widely hated. Agron moved fast. In 231, Illyrian forces won a major victory over the Aetolians, troops hired by Demetrius of Macedon to relieve the siege of Macedon, a town allied with the Acarnanians. The result was more than a battlefield success. It proved that Illyrian forces could face organized Greek opponents and win. Confidence surged, and the raids expanded. The following year, Illyrian attacks pushed as far as the Peloponnese. More important still, they captured Phunis, the northern Epirot city that anchored the region's wealth and security. Phunis was valuable for reasons that were both strategic and practical. It sat near the main north-south route, linking Illyris and Epirus. It controlled fertile lowlands and an outlet to the sea at Onchesmus. For ships heading north along the coast, that harbour mattered. Ancient vessels could not simply sail for days without stopping. They needed regular havens not only to escape storms but to beach, gather food and water, dry out the hull interior, and deal with the ship-boring pests that attacked timber. Onchesmus was effectively the last reliable harbour before a long stretch of coast where safe stops were scarce. In a world where logistics ruled the sea, Phoenice was a prize that could shape an entire coastline. Agron did not live long to enjoy it. He died soon after, reportedly from illness following celebrations that ran too hard, too long. Succession passed to his young son Pinu, but real power fell to Teuta, who ruled as regent. She inherited a fragile advantage. Epirus, shaken by Phoenice's loss, aligned itself with the Aetolian and Achaean powers, and an allied army was sent north as soon as it could be assembled. Scerdoleidas led an Illyrian force south to meet them, perhaps 10,000 strong. The two armies came close to battle near Passaron, in the region of modern Ioannina, and for a moment the fate of Greece's northwest coastline seemed to rest on the next decision. The confrontation never happened. A crisis inside Teuta's coalition pulled her attention back north. A tribe within the Confederacy rebelled and called in support from the Dardanians, groups based north of Macedon and northeast of Illyris. Dardanian raids were a recurring threat, often carried out by combined tribal forces seeking profit and leverage. Teuta recalled her army. Scerdoleidas withdrew, plundering as he went, and negotiated a settlement with Epirus. He kept the loot taken from Phoenice and accepted a substantial ransom in exchange for returning the city largely intact. The Dardanian danger faded quickly and Teuta returned to expansion. Her next target was Issa, an island neighbour of Pharos. This was not random aggression. Issa, alongside Corcyra and Pharos, was one of the key commercial islands of the Adriatic corridor. Its prosperity came from local production and, even more importantly, from harbours that served timber and other trade moving up and down the sea lanes. Issa town was the largest Greek settlement in Dalmatia, and on islands like these, controlling the main port often meant controlling the island itself. Teuta already held Pharos and its dependency, Black Corcyra. If Issa and Corcyra could be added to that network, revenue would rise sharply and her position would shift from regional contender to dominant power. When the campaigning season of 229 opened, Teuta launched a major operation while the siege of Issa continued. Illyrian forces struck first at Epidamnus, a Greek trading city on the Illyrian coast, with an excellent harbour and control of the key inland route leading toward Macedon. In later centuries, the Romans would formalize that corridor as the Via Egnatia, but even now its importance was obvious. The attack was repelled by desperate resistance, yet the attempt signaled intent. The Illyrians then moved to join the main fleet, which had Corcyra town under siege. The coastal Greek cities understood the pattern. If Corcyra fell, Epidamnus and Apollonia could be next. Appeals went out to the Aetolians and Achaeans, who raised a small fleet and sailed to relieve Corcyra. On paper, this looked like a manageable challenge. In practice, the Illyrians had strengthened their naval power. Their usual force relied on lemboi, small fast ships suited to raiding and coastal fighting. But they had also acquired larger warships on loan from the Acarnanians, grateful for Illyrian help earlier at Macedon. The fleets met off Paxoi. The clash ended as another Illyrian victory, reinforcing the same message that had begun to spread since Agron's triumphs. This was not only piracy, not only scattered coastal violence. A power was taking shape on the Adriatic, and Rome had now been drawn directly into its path. Corcyra did not hold out for long. The city surrendered and an Illyrian garrison took control under Demetrius of Pharos. With that island secured, the main body of Tutor's forces shifted back toward the mainland, returning to the unfinished business at Epidamnus. The pattern was familiar in power politics. One success opened the door to the next, and the momentum itself began to reshape the region. The biggest change came not from another siege, but from a sudden realignment. Epirus, shaken by defeat and unnerved by how little protection its recent partners could provide, pulled away from the Aetolian-Achaean coalition it had only just joined. That alliance had sent a relief fleet, yet it had failed at sea, and the impression it left behind was weakness. In the panic and uncertainty that followed, Epirus leaders chose a different path and reached an agreement with the Illyrians instead. The price was high. Epirus ceded Atintanis, the district that controlled the approaches around the pass near Antigonia, a critical gateway on the borderland between Illyris and Epirus. With that deal, Illyrian influence expanded in a way that no raid could match. Control, direct or indirect, now stretched along an immense ribbon of coastline, running from the Dalmatian shores down toward the Gulf of Ambracia. Earlier victories as mercenaries for Macedon had also earned Illyrian leaders a degree of goodwill from what was often the strongest political force in the Greek world. Alliances with Epirus and Acarnania added another layer of security, closing off certain shores to opportunistic plunder. Yet the meaning of the moment went beyond piracy. Tutor's position was changing fast. The figure who had looked like a raiding queen was beginning to resemble the ruler of a compact but serious coastal dominion, held together by garrisons, treaties, and seized harbours. The campaign of 229, seen from that angle, was not only aggressive expansion for its own sake, it also had the logic of defence. Issa had reached out to Rome the year before, looking for help. In practical terms, there were not many other doors left to knock on. Issa was ringed by enemies. The Aetolians and Achaeans had just been beaten. Macedon was distracted, struck by trouble on its northern frontier, and its leadership was unstable due to a sudden change at the top. The larger powers that usually shaped Greek politics were, for the moment, unable to act quickly or decisively. That vacuum made Rome look like the nearest reliable counterweight. The appeal from Issa likely travelled through Syracuse in Sicily because Issa had been founded from there and still had strong ties to its original mother city. Syracuse's ruler, Hero II, was also one of Rome's most valuable allies, and a man with reasons to keep Adriatic sea lanes open. Through that chain of connections, a local emergency became a Roman concern, and the result was the ill-fated embassy led by the Coruncanius brothers. After that confrontation, Teuta could assume an invasion was no longer hypothetical. Her early moves in 229 fit a defensive strategy as much as an offensive one. Pharos and Corcyra were already under her influence. Epidamnus and Issa were under pressure. If Apollonia could be taken too, the remaining landing points for a Roman force would shrink dramatically. A strip of coast dotted with hostile harbours could turn a Roman expedition into a logistical gamble before it even began. The threat spoken in Tota's pavilion, though delivered in anger, carried weight because it matched Rome's recent behaviour. The Roman state had been expanding for generations. Over the course of 2 centuries, Rome pushed outward from the city, dominating neighbouring communities and then absorbing wide zones of central and northern Italy. Control was stabilised through local elites, who were encouraged to cooperate, and through colonies planted in strategic places. These settlements served as anchors of Roman influence and often required the redistribution of land, a simple method of making conquest permanent. Rome did not rule this growing sphere through a single centralized bureaucracy. Instead, it built a flexible system of dependent partnerships. Conquered communities might keep their own local institutions, but they did so inside agreements that affirmed Roman dominance. Some received limited citizenship rights, others broader privileges, but the common thread was obligation. Allies were not primarily squeezed for money, they were expected to provide soldiers. This created a military engine unlike anything else in the Mediterranean, because Rome's manpower increased as its influence spread. By the middle of the 3rd century, the numbers Rome could mobilize were immense compared to any rival power. That arrangement also carried a built-in pressure for further campaigns. Since allies were not paying regular tribute, Rome's main benefit from the network was the ability to field large armies. Armies, once available, tend to be used. Expansion became both a habit and a solution, feeding prestige, security, and opportunity at the same time. Attention then turned to the long-troubled south of Italy, a region shaped by centuries of Greek settlement and often described as Greater Greece. Rome's involvement was presented as assistance against hostile hill peoples, yet the practical effect was the installation of Roman garrisons in Greek cities. Tarentum, the most powerful city in Italy after Rome, read this correctly as an imperial move, the beginning of deeper control and cultural transformation. The clash that followed was more than a dispute over walls and troops. It exposed a widening fault line between Roman power and Greek independence. Tarentum called for help from Pyrrhus of Epirus, a king with a formidable military reputation and ambitions to match. He crossed into Italy with a strikingly capable army and won early victories that made Rome fear it might lose the south altogether. The struggle that followed became one of the defining shocks in Rome's political memory. Even when defeated in battle, Rome repeatedly raised new forces and returned. Pyrrhus could win, yet each win cost so much that it weakened his position rather than securing it. Eventually, he withdrew back across the sea, leaving the southern cities to face Rome alone. And not long afterward, he died during another campaign. The lesson Rome drew was not subtle. Invasion became a nightmare that haunted policy, and fear can easily be turned into justification. The aftermath of that war was still fresh, when Rome was pulled into an even harsher ordeal, a long conflict with Carthage that demanded fleets, overseas supply lines, and sustained campaigning far from home. By the end, Rome emerged with new capabilities and new possessions. Sicily and then Sardinia became its first overseas holdings, and Roman leaders gained practical experience in managing distant operations and keeping armies active across the sea. Against that background, the Coruncanius threat had substance. Rome had already proven that it could project force beyond Italy when it chose to. Sicily had been an obvious first target because of its proximity, but the Adriatic was hardly a distant world. At the narrowest point, the water between the heel of Italy and the coast of western Greece was a relatively short crossing. Meanwhile, Rome had been strengthening the eastern shoreline of Italy through new colonies and expanding trade. More ships meant more merchants, more complaints, and more pressure to act when routes turned dangerous. There were additional incentives pushing Rome toward intervention. Syracuse, deeply involved in Adriatic commerce, likely felt the impact of Illyrian raiding as well, and its ruler had influence in Roman decision-making because of the alliance between them. Rome was also dealing with threats in the north from Celtic groups around the Po Valley, and secure transport along the Adriatic could matter in any wider military emergency. In such a climate, a diplomatic mission could easily become a search for justification, rather than a sincere attempt at compromise. After the envoys were killed, the justification arrived in its most dramatic form. Inside Rome, the decision-making machinery was controlled by a narrow elite. The state was not run by a single monarch, yet it was not a broad democracy in practice either. The Senate, a council composed of wealthy men who had already held high office, dominated the key choices. Public assemblies existed, and citizens voted for officials and approved measures, but the agenda and direction were usually set by the aristocratic leadership. The Senate debated policy, directed finances, handled foreign relations, and shaped the goals that elected magistrates were expected to carry out. The system relied on prestige and established authority as much as formal power. Senators guided decisions because their advice had become a tradition, and because successful outcomes in the past strengthened their standing. Elected officials, once in office, had wide freedom of action, especially in war, yet their careers depended on the approval of peers and the reputation they built through achievement. Military command offered the most visible route to honour, influence, and lasting family status. That social reality mattered. A relatively small circle of interconnected families competed for office, married into one another, lent money to one another, sponsored one another, and guarded the public image of their ancestors. New men could rise and old lines could fade, but the inner core of the elite retained disproportionate influence and often set the tone of debate. In a society like that, foreign crises were not only threats to be managed, they were also arenas where reputations could be made, rivals outshone, and political futures secured. So when Teuto's power began to harden from raids into regional control, and when Roman envoys died after an already tense confrontation, the momentum in Rome favoured action. The Adriatic problem could be framed as justice for murdered traders, protection for allies, or a necessary step to prevent a dangerous enemy from controlling the sea lanes. Each explanation sounded plausible. Together, they made intervention feel inevitable. In Rome, noble status did not come with fixed hereditary titles that automatically placed one family above another. There were no formal ranks that guaranteed permanent superiority. Standing depended on reputation, and reputation could rise quickly or collapse just as fast. The system offered only a handful of top offices each year, and those offices were temporary. A man might return to the same post after a long interval or try for something higher, but nothing was assured. 1 year in power could be the only chance to prove worth, so the struggle for prominence became relentless. The surest way to add weight to a family name was success in war. In Rome, public office and military command were tightly bound together. The highest magistrates were not merely administrators, they were expected to lead armies. A consul might preside over civic business when necessary, yet the role was understood above all as that of a field commander. Soon after election, an army and a theatre of operations would be allocated. This arrangement shaped the entire political culture. A man who wanted to climb had to show himself in uniform, not only in the forum. Military service was treated as a rite of passage. A young aristocrat could not properly begin a political career without years of campaigning behind him. By late adolescence, Roman males were expected to enter service, and many spent a substantial part of their adult lives under arms. From childhood, they heard stories of earlier victories, heroic ancestors, hard discipline, and the rewards of courage. By the time an ambitious man reached maturity, the values of command, endurance, and battlefield glory had been drilled into him as the normal path to honour. In those first years, a talented young noble might rise to become a military tribune, a position limited in number and important enough to signal promise. It was an apprenticeship in leadership, a place to learn how to give orders, manage men, and navigate rivalries inside the command structure. Later, if he maintained momentum, he could step into offices that formed the usual ladder of advancement. Some became financial officers, some handled civic responsibilities, some oversaw courts, and the most successful reached the consulship. Those who lacked ability were exposed over time because repeated service and repeated scrutiny made incompetence harder to hide. By the time a man reached senior office, many around him already had a sense of whether he could command effectively. This produced a governing class with deep military experience. Even the method used to allocate commands reflected that assumption. Assignments could be distributed in a way that looked almost casual, because the political class, taken as a whole, had spent so many seasons in uniform that a baseline competence could be expected. In that environment, arguments for war did not sound extraordinary. They sounded practical, even natural. Ancient writers sometimes portray the Senate as eager for conflict, and it is not difficult to see why that reputation stuck. The ruling elite had reasons as a group to expand influence, since dominance abroad reinforced authority at home. At the same time, individual senators were driven by personal ambition. War created opportunities for distinction that peacetime rarely offered. Service was framed as duty to family, city, and gods all at once, a combination that made military success feel like moral achievement rather than mere aggression. The great wars with Carthage and the struggles in the Greek-speaking south of Italy changed the scale of possibility. Earlier campaigns in Italy had brought profit, but victories overseas introduced a different level of wealth. Plunder was not an accidental side effect of war. It was woven into how campaigns worked. Soldiers were not lavishly paid, and they expected to improve their position through captured goods. Armies also lived off the land when they could, taking food and supplies wherever opportunity allowed. Allied contingents marched with the same expectations. Over time, participation in Roman wars taught many Italian communities that fighting under Roman banners could bring tangible rewards. Commanders stood at the center of this economy of victory. A general took a share of the spoils, yet he also carried obligations. Campaigns were expensive and the state wanted returns. Wealthy backers expected repayment. The commander had to decide how much to extract for public use while keeping his army satisfied. Too much restraint could anger Rome's political masters, but taking too much for the treasury could provoke resentment among the troops. That balancing act made a successful commander look not only brave, but also shrewd. Beyond the battlefield, a different kind of profit hovered around the general's headquarters. Communities that feared being targeted tried to negotiate. Some hoped to steer an army away from their fields. Others wanted reduced supply demands or protection against rivals. They approached the commander because he held immediate power and payments or gifts could follow, openly or discreetly. The line between acceptable reward and personal enrichment was thin, and there were always ways to cross it without leaving obvious fingerprints. In the ancient world, such practices were common enough that they rarely shocked contemporaries, even if later moralists complained about them. At this early stage of Roman expansion, private commercial planning by senators was not yet a dominant force, but a pattern was beginning to take shape. Wealth gained in war could be invested in land, and land was still considered the most respectable foundation for status. As veterans and small farmers struggled with long absences, debt, or losses, larger estates tended to grow. Large estates required labour, and war supplied labour in the form of captives. More captives meant higher output, and higher output meant more stable income. Farming profits were not as spectacular as the windfalls of conquest, yet they were dependable, and they carried social prestige in a way that trade often did not. This connection between victory and advancement was obvious to everyone. A successful campaign could fund a political career, pay debts incurred in elections, and allow a man to meet the expectations of public generosity that office demanded. State salaries did not cover those expenses. That meant a rising figure often needed military success simply to keep moving forward. For the most fortunate, the reward could culminate in the most public celebration Rome offered. A triumphal procession that turned battlefield achievement into permanent memory. The state gained too. Even when a war was costly, defeated enemies might be forced to pay heavy financial penalties, and captured treasure could flow into public coffers. Over decades, these revenues helped finance new operations, monuments, and political programs. When a society learns that conflict brings both glory and profit, resistance to war weakens. Decisions become easier, especially when the people making policy are also the people most likely to benefit from the outcome. By the Middle Republic, Rome had become a deeply militarized community. A significant portion of adult men served each year, and during emergencies the proportion rose dramatically. The city itself filled with reminders of victory, temples promised in wartime and later, built in fulfillment of vows, statues celebrating commanders, inscriptions that listed conquered peoples and enormous numbers of dead or captured. Public space became a gallery of conquest. Military achievement was not just admired, it was displayed as the highest proof of worth. In such a climate, war could be presented as normal and even desirable. Ordinary soldiers had their own motives, often tied to reward and opportunity, while elites pursued reputation and authority. Conflicts could be framed as defensive actions or protection of weaker allies, and small incidents could be treated as grave provocations. This does not mean Rome started every war or invented every threat, but it does help explain why reports of danger or insult found such receptive listeners. When the Kurankani mission returned with tales of hostility and murder, the story did not fall on skeptical ears. It entered a political culture already prepared to treat confrontation as the proper answer. At the same time, Rome was not acting in a peaceful world disrupted by one unusually aggressive state. The Mediterranean of this era was shaped by constant competition. Illyrian leaders aimed to turn a patchwork of tribes and harbours into a recognized power. Hellenistic kings built legitimacy through conquest and held it through further campaigns. Greek leagues and city-states fought over borders and influence with relentless energy. Many of their top officials carried titles that translated, in effect, as general, and military priorities dominated their term in office. Aggression was condemned loudly when practiced by rivals and defended easily when practiced by oneself. International law in any modern sense did not exist. power politics operated under the assumption that strength decided outcomes, and negotiation often served as a pause rather than a solution when major interests collided. Diplomacy could settle minor disputes, yet large wars were frequently only postponed, especially when pride, suspicion, and ambition were involved. Roman confidence, and at times Roman bluntness, also made compromise harder. A rising power that believed its methods were superior was not always inclined to accept mediation or treat rivals as equals. Rome's first expeditions across the Adriatic were short, almost abrupt. 2 campaigns were fought on the Balkan side, and neither dragged on for years. Once immediate objectives were secured, Roman forces withdrew rather than occupying the region permanently in the modern sense. Even so, withdrawal did not mean a return to the previous order. The appearance of Rome, even briefly, altered expectations, shifted alliances, and created new pressures. The presence of a powerful newcomer changed calculations for communities that lived between rival kings, leagues, and tribal coalitions. The first conflict in Illyris can look straightforward at first glance. Roman envoys had been killed, traders had suffered, complaints about raids had accumulated, a call for help had arrived from Isa, a place with no long-standing relationship with Rome. The response seems practical, rather than sentimental. Rome was not stepping in because of cultural kinship. The motive that sits closest to the surface is economic security. Safer routes, protected trade, and prevention of a hostile power from dominating the Adriatic coast. The invasion force that crossed in 229 was large. Both consular armies assembled at Brundisium, and the crossing involved tens of thousands of men, carried in a sizable fleet. The scale does not necessarily imply a grand plan for permanent conquest. It also reflects uncertainty. Roman commanders could not be sure how strong resistance would be, and Illyrian arms had recently performed well against Greek fleets and coastal cities. Overwhelming force reduced risk. Operations moved fast. One consul advanced on Corcyra, while the other established a base on the mainland at Apollonia. Demetrius of Pharos, the commander holding Corcyra for Teuta, chose to surrender quickly and offered his services to the Romans. With that shift, the islands under his influence followed, and Rome gained a useful guide to local politics. Control of Corcyra also severed the northern Illyrian forces from southern partners along the coast, limiting the chance of coordinated resistance. Sieges were lifted in rapid sequence. Epidamnus was relieved, then Isa, and the immediate crisis ended. Teuta, the young king Pins, and the royal court withdrew to a secure stronghold at Rhizon, tucked into a deep bay with narrow entrances and steep surrounding mountains. It was a defensible refuge, difficult to attack by land or sea. Rome did not need to storm it. Containment was enough. Across the region, several communities moved to place themselves under Roman protection. This was not total annexation, but it was a public acknowledgement of inferior status and a request for Rome to decide the terms of safety. In return, Rome often declared such communities free, meaning self-governing in their local affairs without interference from nearby powers. In practice, this freedom rested on Roman oversight and on Rome's promise to intervene if threats returned. The relationship was informal in tone, but real in consequence. These new partners were treated as friends, yet the friendship ran in one direction. Most Roman troops sailed home, while a smaller force remained through the winter to stabilize the situation and negotiate terms. The settlement that followed reduced Illyrian freedom of action. An indemnity was demanded. Claims over certain communities were abandoned. Limits were imposed on naval movement, especially in the waters south of a defined point on the coast. The message was clear. Illyrian power would be fenced in, and the Adriatic would no longer be an open hunting ground. Demetrius of Pharos emerged as a key figure in the new order. After surrendering, he became Rome's local partner, effectively placed in a position to manage the arrangement on the ground. Rome then withdrew its forces, satisfied enough to celebrate the campaign as a victory, worthy of public honour. Although the war itself was brief, the outcome mattered. A patchwork of coastal cities, islands, and tribal districts now sat inside a Roman sphere of influence. Important harbours were secured. Fertile lowlands that supported grain and pasture fell under protection that favoured Greek coastal communities and limited Illyrian leverage. Mountain tribes that depended on lowland resources had strong incentives to accept the new balance rather than fight it. The cut-off line chosen for Illyrian shipping also drew a cultural boundary of sorts, separating areas dominated by Greek colonies from those considered more purely Illyrian. What Rome intended remains a question that is easy to distort with later knowledge. One interpretation sees a limited intervention designed to suppress raiding and stabilize trade, nothing more. Another interpretation sees something familiar. Rome applying the same pattern used in Italy, building a network of dependent friendships that looked cooperative on the surface but established lasting dominance. The result in southern Illyries resembled Rome's broader method. Lesser states were allowed to run their internal affairs, but only inside an order shaped by Roman power and Roman expectations. In that sense, Rome may not have arrived calling itself a conqueror, yet the structure it introduced made subordination the default outcome. For Polybius, watching from the Greek side of the sea, Rome's first clash with Greek politics carried a heavy meaning. He understood that this initial step would eventually reshape Greece in brutal ways. Yet that outcome still lay far ahead. At this moment, Rome was not arriving with a plan to annex the Greek world. The armies crossed, imposed terms, then left. The pattern repeated later as well. Quick interventions followed by withdrawal. The difference was what remained after the ships sailed home. Each departure left behind a thicker layer of dependence, a wider network of communities that now measured their safety through Rome's approval. A city that had once been focused on Italy was learning to think beyond Italy, expanding its sense of what was possible after the First Punic War had opened new horizons. The Adriatic was no longer a border sea. It was becoming a corridor. In Illyria, a sphere of influence had been planted, even if the Romans did not yet call it that. One question hangs over the aftermath. What about Macedon? This is not only a question raised by later history, when Macedon becomes Rome's main rival in Greece. It is puzzling even in its own time. Rome sent messages to the Aetolians and Achaeans, which made sense because these leagues had presented themselves as defenders of those threatened by Illyrian raids. Delegations were also sent to cities like Corinth and Athens, places chosen as symbols of the Greek world and its prestige. Yet no embassy went to Pella, the Macedonian court. That omission looks less like a simple oversight and more like a deliberate slight, or at least it could easily be read that way. Macedon was weak in that moment, strained by raids from the north and distracted by internal uncertainty after a king's death. Still, for more than a century it had been treated as the leading power in Greece, the state that claimed the right to arbitrate disputes and set the balance of force. Rome's actions on the western coastline highlighted Macedonian weakness in front of the Greek world. Even if the Romans did not intend to embarrass Macedon, their intervention suggested that a task once expected of Macedonian kings now had to be handled by outsiders. A diplomatic explanation could have softened the effect. Silence did the opposite. it is difficult to justify the choice. Corinth and Athens were not directly involved in the Illyrian crisis. They mattered because of their reputation, because they stood as famous names. If Rome wanted to appear as the rescuer of Greece, that story could have been delivered just as easily in Pella. In fact, Macedon had reasons to welcome the reduction of piracy, since Macedonian trade also used those routes. Even if some Illyrian leaders had been Macedonian partners or mercenary allies, Macedon still had strong interests on the coast. The western ports were gateways for commerce in peacetime and strategic corridors in war. The region fell well within Macedon's sense of its own sphere, even if it had never fully controlled it. Rome must have known that. By failing to make contact, Rome created an uneasy tension that could not be ignored forever. After the Romans sailed away early in 228, nearly a decade passed before they returned. In that interval, the Balkan and Greek political landscape shifted repeatedly, as if the ground itself could not settle. The alliance between the Aetolian and Achaean leagues collapsed. Macedon, now under Antigonus Doson, initially leaned one way, then reversed. The Achaean League pursued a policy of drawing the Peloponnese into its orbit, pressing the remaining holdouts to join. Sparta, under a reforming and ambitious king, resisted, and Aetolia supported the resistance not from affection for Sparta but from rivalry with Achaea. The conflict intensified until Achaea, threatened with collapse, invited Macedon into the heart of Greek affairs. The price was high. Control of a great fortress that dominated Corinth passed into Macedonian hands. Doson then abandoned earlier understandings with Aetolia and built a larger structure of alliances, gathering multiple Greek leagues into a common front under Macedonian leadership. The immediate excuse was the Spartan War, but the deeper target was Aetolia. When Sparta was defeated at Silesia, Macedon stood once more as the central power broker of Greece. Doson did not live long enough to consolidate everything. He died in 221, leaving a teenage king, Philip V, at the head of a revived Macedonian position and facing Aetolian hostility. And anyone expecting a pliable boy soon learned otherwise. Philip moved quickly to secure his court, harden his authority and push back raids from the north. He did not behave like a fragile heir. He behaved like someone determined to restore Macedon's standing. War in Greece resumed with depressing speed. In the late 200s, political pressure in the Peloponnese again drove cities into confrontation. Aetolia intervened in local disputes, raids escalated, and the Macedonian-led alliance voted for war. The conflict that followed, known later as the Social War, spread beyond the Peloponnese. Philip struck into Aetolian territory, absorbed blows in return, and reinforced the position of allies along the west coast facing Italy. He recovered key points, improved ports, strengthened fortifications, and took control of routes that made movement between Macedon and the western shoreline easier. By the end of the war, Macedon's influence on the coast had grown. The west was being tightened into a network of loyal partners and accessible harbours. Then the familiar instability of Illyrian politics returned, not as a minor nuisance, but as a strategic disruption. Demetrius of Pharos, once installed with Roman approval after surrendering, began to act in ways that made his earlier alignment look temporary and opportunistic. His choices are hard to read as anything but a gamble. He strengthened his position through marriage into the northern royal circle, gaining a form of legitimacy as guardian of the young king. Yet Rome's settlement had deliberately split the region, keeping the northern court confined while placing Demetrius over the richer southern districts. Instead of preserving that arrangement, he turned against it. Reports portray him attacking communities under Roman protection. That was more than ordinary piracy. It was a direct challenge to the system Rome had imposed. The most plausible explanation is timing. Rome was tied down in northern Italy, fighting dangerous Celtic coalitions and dealing with raids and piracy at the head of the Adriatic. In such moments, distant clients sometimes test the limits. Demetrius appears to have believed that Roman attention was elsewhere and that a bold move might go unpunished. Ambition alone can explain part of it. The benefits of being Rome's partner were real, but perhaps he believed he could become something larger by rebuilding a unified Illyrian power, or at least by stepping out from Rome's shadow. Northern Illyrian leaders, squeezed into poorer territory and facing hard years, had every incentive to resume raiding. A promise of revival could have been offered to him. Restore the old strength, stop acting like a Roman dependent, reopen the sea as a source of wealth. Polybius's harsh assessment of Demetrius, that he possessed daring but lacked sound judgment, fits the pattern. He acted as if Rome's reaction would be slow or limited. He misread the kind of state Rome had become. By the summer of 220, Demetrius and Scerdylidas sailed south with a large flotilla of light ships, linking up with Greek partners for raids that targeted towns connected to the Achaean League. When the first attack failed, Demetrius continued into wider piracy among the Aegean islands, operating on a scale that matched royal pretensions. Scerdylidas returned north but remained involved in opportunistic warfare, switching sides when profit demanded it. He fought with Aetolia, complained of being cheated, accepted Macedonian payments, then later broke away again when he claimed promises were not kept. The pattern was consistent. Alliances were tools, not commitments. Macedon also drew Demetrius into its orbit. Philip paid him to harass Aetolian positions on the west coast. With Macedonian backing behind him, Demetrius pushed into southern Illyris again and detached districts from Roman influence, persuading a key fortress to join him. From Rome's perspective, this was no longer a question of one rogue leader raiding for wealth. It was the emergence of a hostile network that could expose the entire western Greek coastline to pressure and disrupt the Adriatic routes Rome was increasingly determined to control. Macedon had accepted as a partner a man openly hostile to Rome's settlement, and Macedon itself was strengthening its reach along the coast. The horizon was changing. Rome watched for a time without moving. The delay did not mean indifference. It reflected competing emergencies. Campaigns in northern Italy demanded attention. Piracy in the upper Adriatic had to be suppressed. Fighting in alpine regions pulled armies into difficult terrain. Yet by the summer of 219, the response arrived with unmistakable force. Both consular armies were sent across the sea. The timing was not accidental. Trouble in Spain was escalating, and the crisis that would ignite the Second Punic War was approaching rapidly. Rome could not afford to leave a dangerous situation unresolved in the Adriatic, while a far larger war loomed in the west. Sending both armies signalled urgency. Overwhelming strength offered the fastest path to a clean result. The motives were layered. Protecting commerce and preventing strong hostile neighbours remained central, just as they had been a decade earlier. Yet there was also a moral and political element now. Demetrius had accepted Rome's friendship and then acted as an enemy. That betrayal demanded punishment, both to remove the threat and to make an example. In this logic, severity was part of strategy. A defector would be crushed. Others who could be folded into Rome's protection might be spared. At the same time, Macedon could no longer be ignored. Even if the Romans had treated it casually in 229, they now faced a Macedonian king who had regained leadership over much of Greece through alliances and war. His campaigns were reinforcing the west coast. His court had welcomed Demetrius. His influence was expanding at the very moment Rome needed stability in the Adriatic. Losing the coastal network in Illyris would mean allowing a revived Macedon, or Macedon's clients, to dominate the shoreline opposite Italy. The strategic danger was obvious. Denying that Rome was thinking about Macedon at all requires imagining a level of blindness that does not fit the evidence of Roman behaviour elsewhere. Rome knew Macedon's reputation, knew the symbolic weight of its kingship in Greece, and could see that Philip was not a passive figure. By the end of the social war, he stood at the centre of Greek politics, celebrated by many allies, as the one who had brought order and victory. Limiting Demetrius also limited Philip's options on the western coast. For Rome, that was a useful outcome, even if it was not yet framed as a full confrontation. For the moment, however, Rome did not need to announce a grand eastern policy. Greece was divided, Philip was engaged in war, and Rome's immediate goal was to secure its Adriatic position before the Carthaginian storm broke. A second intervention in Illyris was the practical step, a fast, forceful operation meant to keep the sea lanes safe, remove a dangerous turncoat, and prevent a powerful Macedonian-led system from sealing off the coastline facing Italy. The deeper collision with Macedon was approaching, but it had not yet arrived. The Second Illyrian War unfolded with remarkable speed, exactly as Rome intended. With a looming confrontation against Carthage, the Romans had no desire for a prolonged campaign. Demetrius of Pharos, aware of what was coming, tried to prepare. He stationed a garrison at Demale, a fortress believed to be unassailable, and placed another force of 6,000 men in his home city of Pharos. At the same time, he worked quietly behind the scenes, replacing pro-Roman leaders across southern Illyria with men loyal to him. It was a calculated political gamble, but one that failed almost immediately. Demale fell after only 7 days of siege. The fortress may have been strong, but the sheer size and determination of the Roman army proved overwhelming. Once news spread of its fall, resistance elsewhere collapsed. Towns and communities that had sided with Demetrius surrendered at once, many of them lacking the troops needed to mount any real defence. The Roman forces then turned toward the island of Pharos. Its main town, today known as Astari Grad, posed a far greater challenge. Strong walls, a sizable garrison, and a narrow harbour made a direct assault dangerous. The Romans advanced carefully, sending a squadron of 20 ships toward the harbour entrance, as if preparing to land. Demetrius responded by leading his troops out from behind the city walls to block the approach. What he did not know was that most of the Roman army had already been concealed in wooded terrain behind the town during the previous night. The moment Demetrius committed his forces, the hidden troops advanced. The Illyrians suddenly found themselves cut off from their fortifications, caught between enemies attacking from both directions. The battle was effectively decided before it truly began. Demetrius managed to escape by slipping away in small ships hidden in a nearby cove. He abandoned his soldiers to slaughter and left his family behind, who were taken into captivity and sent to Italy. Within weeks, the war was over. Demetrius eventually reached the fleet of King Philip at Actium, where he was welcomed and soon became one of the king's closest advisors. He remained in Philip's service until his death in 214, still fighting on Macedon's behalf. If a formal settlement followed the war, it has left little trace. The Illyrian king Pins was likely forced to pay another indemnity, though later Roman envoys sent to demand overdue payments may have been referring to earlier obligations. Rome expanded its influence by adding Demale to its sphere of control. While, in northern Illyria, Scerdylides emerged as the dominant ruler with Roman backing. This shift marked the end of Ardeaean rule and the rise of the Labiatian dynasty. Despite how easily the campaign was won, both Roman consuls were awarded triumphs. As before, Roman troops were withdrawn immediately. No garrisons were left behind, and there was no permanent military presence east of Italy. Cost was one reason, but urgency elsewhere mattered more. In 218, Hannibal would cross the Alps, and Roman armies would be needed at home. For now, Rome had achieved its objectives. Demetrius was removed, trade routes in the Adriatic were secured, and Roman resolve had been clearly demonstrated. That demonstration did not go unnoticed. Especially to Philip of Macedon, Rome had shown that it was willing to intervene far beyond Italy when its interests were threatened. This realization would have consequences far beyond Illyria. In the Roman Republic, military success was the most reliable path to political advancement. A young aristocrat proved his value through victory, climbed the ranks, and sought higher office. If granted command of an army and successful in battle, he could petition the Senate for the highest honor a Roman general could receive: a triumph. Not every request was approved, but the attempt was essential. A triumph fixed a man's name in public memory and often guaranteed further political success. The ceremony itself followed strict conventions. A general awaiting a decision could not enter the city with his troops. Instead, the Senate met beyond Rome's sacred boundary to judge whether his victory was worthy. Though guidelines existed, such as minimum enemy casualties, they were inconsistently applied. What mattered most was whether Rome's power had been meaningfully expanded. Even the Illyrian campaigns qualified. If approved, the decision was passed to the people, who never refused. The general then entered the city in ceremonial splendor, riding through cheering crowds. He wore purple, rode a chariot, and was followed by spoils of war, captives, and visual reminders of conquered lands. The procession ended at the Temple of Jupiter, where sacrifices were made in gratitude. To temper pride, tradition held that a slave stood nearby, whispering reminders of mortality. Triumphs were expensive, but the Senate paid the cost, confident that captured wealth would soon replenish the treasury. If a triumph was denied, lesser honors were possible, or a general could fund his own celebration outside Rome. Such privately funded triumphs were officially recorded and carried nearly equal prestige. The display itself mattered more than who paid for it. After the Illyrian Wars, Rome had no standing army in the Balkans and no declared imperial policy toward Greece. Its actions had been cautious and defensive, yet 4 triumphs had been awarded for relatively minor wars. Booty flowed into Rome, provoking envy and accusations of corruption. Meanwhile, Greek states took note. As Rome showed even limited involvement in the region, appeals for Roman mediation multiplied. Each intervention carried consequences. Once a great power involves itself in the affairs of smaller states, influence gradually becomes control. Rome's actions in Illyria planted the seeds of deeper engagement in Greece. At the same time, they heightened tensions with Macedon. Macedonian kings had long seen themselves as protectors of Greece against outsiders, and Rome appeared to be just another barbarian intrusion. To the Greeks, Romans were barbarians in language and increasingly in behavior. Philip, in particular, viewed Roman presence as both an insult and a threat. His resolve to resist would eventually draw Rome permanently into Greek affairs. Yet resistance was not his only ambition. Philip had ended the social war abruptly in 217, before his allies achieved their aims. According to contemporary accounts, news of Roman disaster at Lake Trasimene had stirred greater thoughts. Demetrius of Pharos suggested that Illyria could serve as a base for future action against Italy. Initially, this was likely a personal scheme aimed at regaining power, but the idea lingered. Some modern historians doubt that Philip seriously considered such plans. Macedon lacked resources, naval strength, and access to the western coast. Even contemporary sources admit Philip kept his ambitions private. Yet these objections overlook his character. He was young, energetic, and bold, shaped by the traditions of aggressive Hellenistic kingship. He imagined himself a conqueror in the tradition of Alexander and ruled an economy that depended on constant warfare. Philip's coinage portrayed confidence and resolve. His authority rested on expansion and victory. It would be unwise to assume that Italy never crossed his mind. Contemporary poets mocked the scale of his ambition, suggesting that only Olympus itself remained unconquered. This does not mean an invasion was imminent. Rather, Philip's actions suggest preparation. Control of Illyria and the western coast offered options, whether for an opportunistic strike or cooperation with Rome's enemies. Above all, Rome's presence in the region represented a potential bridgehead against Macedon. By the end of the Second Illyrian War, Rome and Macedon recognized each other as future adversaries. Neither moved openly against the other, yet. Instead, they watched carefully, measuring strength and intent like rivals circling before a fight that both sensed was inevitable. By 217, as leaders gathered at Naupactus and the social war in Greece came to an end, Rome and Macedon had begun to recognize a hard truth. Under the right conditions, the two powers could end up fighting. In the years that followed, the atmosphere grew steadily more tense, and much of that pressure came from Philip V. Rome had withdrawn its troops after the Second Illyrian War, leaving no permanent force in the region, and it might be tempting to imagine that Philip read this as weakness or indifference. For decades, Macedon had acted as the dominant force in Greek politics, behaving as if the peninsula existed for its own security and advantage. Yet Philip did more than simply reinforce Macedonian influence inside Greece. He began taking steps that, from Rome's perspective, looked openly hostile, steps that invited an eventual response, especially once he moved toward cooperation with Hannibal. From Philip's point of view, Rome threatened Macedon's position as the leading power in Greece. That threat, however distant geographically, was real enough to require action. The first priority was the Adriatic flank. Rome's foothold among communities in southern Illyria and the political network that came with it. Some later observers might treat that Roman influence as limited, but Philip did not. He considered it a wedge that could be driven deeper, and he aimed to remove it, ideally by placing Demetrius of Pharos back in the area as an ally, a client, or at least a friendly figure who would shut the door on Rome. In this sense, Philip acted as the initiator, even if he could frame his behaviour as defensive. He believed he was pushing out an outsider and restoring Greek cities to a Greek sphere. For a time, he faced little immediate punishment because Rome was fighting for survival in Italy. But eventually the Roman tolerance reached its limit, and what followed was the long beginning of Macedon's humiliation. The first war between Rome and Macedon would not be clean or decisive. It was messy, scattered, and often frustrating, not because Rome lacked interest, but because Rome was overextended. The commitment existed, yet the resources were being consumed elsewhere. Even so, the result was unmistakable. By the end of that conflict, Rome was far more deeply entangled in Greek politics than it had been at the start, and it carried more weight and authority there. Because the war did not settle the underlying rivalry, renewed trouble with Macedon was only a matter of time. While tension was building in the east, the main Roman emergency was Hannibal. His march over the Alps in 218 had cost him dearly in men and animals. But his strategy did not rely on arriving with an untouched army. He expected reinforcement through politics as much as through logistics. The Roman campaigns against the Celts of the Po Valley in the late 200s had been brutal, and Hannibal counted on that resentment. He also believed that success on Italian soil would pull other dissatisfied allies away from Rome, especially among Greek communities in the south. His invasion depended on turning Roman unity into Roman fragmentation. Hannibal's first major clash with Roman forces came in December 218 at the Trebia, where he won decisively. That victory secured Celtic loyalty and gave him the rich Po Valley as a base for supplies. He then moved into Italy's heart, and in June 217 he destroyed another Roman army at Lake Trasimene, killing or capturing tens of thousands in a matter of hours. After that disaster, he advanced down the eastern side of Italy with no one able to stop him. Rome responded by giving extraordinary authority to Quintus Fabius Maximus, who adopted a strategy that looked cowardly to many, but was designed for survival. He followed Hannibal closely, prevented him from marching straight on Rome, and refused pitched battle. The idea was simple. The fewer spectacular victories Hannibal won, the less likely Rome's allies would defect, and the more restless Hannibal's own coalition would become. Many of his men wanted a fast triumph and rich plunder, not a grinding campaign with no decisive payoff. Inside Rome, opponents of Fabius argued that this approach was weakness, disguised as wisdom, and they forced a return to open battle. The result at Cannae in August 216 was catastrophic. One of the worst defeats in Roman history wiped out almost an entire army. Panic surged through the city. In a moment of fear and desperation, Rome even resorted to human sacrifice, a practice it rarely used, burying alive victims chosen as offerings against further disaster. Then, after the shock passed, Rome did what it always did. It continued the fight. Cannae proved how correct Fabius had been. Rome shifted into a war of attrition, slow and brutal, designed to exhaust Hannibal rather than crush him in one dramatic clash. It was dangerously close to collapse. After Cannae, defections spread. Parts of Sicily and many Greek communities in southern Italy aligned with Hannibal, including major cities such as Tarentum and Capua. In effect, much of the south slipped from Roman control. In the north, the Celts stirred again. In 215, Hannibal gained a new partner when Philip V of Macedon agreed to cooperate with him, and soon afterward Syracuse, long Rome's key ally in the region, fell under a new ruler who also leaned toward Hannibal. For Rome, these developments felt like the nightmare scenario, the possibility of enemies pressing from different directions at once. Yet wars of attrition punish invaders. Slowly, the balance began to shift. Syracuse was recovered in 211 after a long siege. Meanwhile, Philip, despite his alliance with Hannibal, was drawn into conflicts in Greece and could not deliver a decisive blow against Rome. Hannibal found himself increasingly isolated. His strongest support in Italy came mainly from Greek cities, while the Latin colonies, Rome's fortified backbone, did not break. He also never succeeded in tearing open the Roman defensive system to threaten the city itself. He remained dangerous, but he could not translate battlefield brilliance into strategic victory. Rome began sending a message to wavering allies, with calculated harshness. Capua, Hannibal's most important northern stronghold and the jewel of fertile Campania, was retaken in 211 after siege and pressure. Its punishment was devastating, its political structure was dismantled, and its lands were taken into Roman control. In 209, Tarentum was recaptured and sacked so severely that it never truly recovered. These acts were not only military victories, they were warnings, visible demonstrations of what happened to communities that gambled against Rome. In Spain, the other major front, Rome faced dangerous setbacks in 211. Then it made a surprising decision, sending a very young commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, into a war zone that had already broken experienced men. The gamble paid off. By 206, he had driven the Carthaginians out of Spain and destroyed the foundations of their overseas power. Returning to Rome with rising prestige, he argued that the war should be taken directly to Africa, rather than chasing Hannibal endlessly through Italy. Hannibal, in his view, was now pinned down and gradually losing options. Scipio persuaded the Roman leadership, and once again the strategy proved effective. After early difficulty, he forced Carthage toward peace in 203. Fighting resumed when Hannibal returned from Italy, before agreements could settle. But the final confrontation came at Zama in 202, where Hannibal's last great army was defeated. The terms imposed on Carthage were harsh enough to refill Rome's exhausted finances and keep Carthage quiet for years. Scipio received the honorary name Africanus and was celebrated in Rome almost like a divine figure. In later generations, charismatic commanders would learn to weaponize such adoration against the Republic itself. Scipio did not push that path to its extreme, but his rise showed how powerful military glory could become inside Roman politics. While Rome fought for its life against Carthage, Philip pursued his own strategy with energy and precision. Once free from the social war in Greece, he moved quickly to strengthen Macedon's position, especially toward the west. Late in 217, he campaigned in Dasaretes, regaining control over the main route linking Macedon with southern Illyria north of the Prespar Lakes, the corridor that would later become a critical military road across the Balkans. Earlier, he had taken Bilazora, helping stabilize his borders. Step by step, he reduced vulnerability and increased room to maneuver. Around this time, Rome made formal contact with Philip for the first time, not with friendly greetings, but by demanding the surrender of Demetrius of Pharos. Such a request might have sounded normal if there had been an established relationship, but as an opening move, it was bold and almost arrogant. Philip appears to have ignored it. The demand did not fade. It lingered as an insult and a reminder that Rome felt entitled to make demands in the Greek world. Philip's campaigns then became not only strategic moves, but also statements. He was not going to hand over a man he had chosen to protect. On the contrary, he meant to use Demetrius to rebuild influence in Illyria. In 216, Philip took a newly built fleet of 100 small fast vessels and sailed around Greece, aiming toward the Illyrian coast. Near Apollonia, Roman warships appeared. The force was small, only 10 ships, but it had arrived because Cerdylidas, an Illyrian leader aligned with Rome, warned the Romans that Philip was preparing to strike their friends. Philip assumed the Roman ships were only the front edge of something larger and chose to withdraw. He was not ready for a full confrontation at sea. Still, the moment showed how close both sides were drifting toward open conflict. That drift became far more dangerous in 215. Rome had just suffered the nightmare of Cannae. Hannibal looked unstoppable. Philip, on Rome's eastern flank, began to resemble a second Pyrrhus in Roman imagination, another Greek king who might exploit Roman weakness. At that vulnerable moment, Philip and Hannibal agreed on cooperation. For most of its history, Rome had avoided facing multiple, great threats at once. Now it appeared to be happening. The opening moves of that alliance had the dramatic clarity of a spy story. Philip sent an agent, Xenophanes of Athens, to Hannibal in Italy. He passed through Roman-controlled areas by claiming he was travelling to negotiate with Rome, then slipped into Hannibal's camp. Terms were discussed. Xenophanes departed with Carthaginian representatives, but their ship was intercepted. The agent tried the same deception again, but the presence of the Carthaginians made the story collapse. Roman searchers found a letter from Hannibal to Philip and a draft treaty awaiting Philip's approval. The text was read aloud in the Senate, and its implications were alarming. It laid out broad mutual cooperation, including an expectation that Philip and his Greek partners would assist Hannibal against Rome in Italy. In return, Hannibal promised that after victory he would ensure Rome could not make war on Macedon and would abandon its position among specific Illyrian communities. Because the treaty had been seized before formal approval, Rome did not panic immediately. Instead, it took practical precautions. The Adriatic fleet was reinforced under Publius Valerius Flaccus to block or delay any eastern approach into Italy and to watch the Illyrian coastline. Another commander, Marcus Valerius Laevanus, was instructed to move if intelligence indicated a real threat to contain Philip inside Macedon. The alliance between Philip and Hannibal made strategic sense for both sides, but it also guaranteed that Rome would treat Philip as an enemy worth crushing. Roman fears were sharpened by memory. Laevanus's own family history included defeat at Pyrrhus's hands, an older trauma now echoing in a new form. At first, reports did not force Rome to commit fully in the east. Philip, as often in Greek politics, was entangled in other conflicts. Macedonian intervention was needed in the Peloponnese to support Achaean allies. Sparta remained hostile, and Messene threatened to break away. Messene was forced back into line, and during that campaign in 214 Demetrius of Pharos died, ending the career of the very man Philip had once intended to install in Illyria. The Greek world's constant local wars slowed Philip's ability to act, but they also offered him reasons to keep armies moving and influence expanding. Once Philip felt those southern issues were contained, he returned to the Adriatic question. Between 214 and 212, he launched repeated attacks on Rome's friends in southern Illyria, gradually widening Macedonian influence and shrinking the network of communities tied to Rome. He was working toward a simple goal: erase the Roman presence. The only question was when Rome would have enough freedom to react. The campaign of 214 appears to have been coordinated with Hannibal. Philip moved his army through Epirus toward Illyria, while his fleet sailed to strike Apollonia, by sea and land. Such a maneuver depended on the Roman Adriatic fleet being distracted, and Hannibal provided that by threatening Tarentum at the same time. Apollonia resisted stubbornly. Seeking a coastal base quickly, Philip shifted to Oricum, which fell, and he left a small garrison there before turning back toward Apollonia. But Oricum managed to send an urgent message to Laevanus. Philip expected Rome to be overwhelmed. Hannibal's pressure continued, and Syracuse had just turned against Rome under its new ruler, ending decades of loyalty. Yet Laevanus, given eastern command, sailed with most of the fleet, made Corcyra his base, and recaptured Oricum with ease. The smoothness of that operation should not hide its significance. Roman and Macedonian soldiers had now clashed directly. No formal declaration had been made, but the first war between Rome and Macedon had effectively begun. Laevanus then moved to secure Apollonia. Roman ships trapped Philip's fleet near a river mouth, forcing Philip to burn his own vessels, rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Roman rumour later claimed he fled half-dressed in panic, a story shaped for propaganda. The reality was simpler. A commander who could order a fleet destroyed had enough control to organise his retreat. What mattered was the outcome. Rome had demonstrated dominance at sea. Laevanus wintered at Oricum, and his command was extended with an aggressive mandate that effectively named Greece and Macedon as his arena. Philip's misjudgment carried a heavy price. He lost a fleet and was restricted mainly to land operations until another could be built. Men died in the failed coastal effort, and Rome now had a foothold again in Illyria. Yet Philip recovered quickly. In the following season, he advanced toward the Illyrian mountains, detached local tribes from Rome's influence, retook Demale, and finally seized Lissus. That port mattered. It offered a harbour facing Italy, shipyards for rebuilding naval power, and farmland capable of feeding an army operating on the coast. After Lissus fell, surrounding tribes hurried to submit. Skerdalidas was squeezed northward, separated from Rome's southern contacts by a Macedonian wedge on the coast. Philip's long pressure campaign had paid off. With Philip holding Lissus and the Roman fleet anchored at Oricum, the situation slipped into stalemate for months. Rome was still fighting for survival in Italy and Sicily, and the fall of Tarentum in 212 intensified fears. Tarentum could serve as an ideal landing point if a force sailed from Lissus. Rome could not afford to be surprised. If Philip could not be checked directly with full Roman strength, someone else would have to do it. Laevinus turned to the Aetolian League, the only major Greek power with substantial military ability that was not aligned with Philip. Officially, Aetolia had been bound to peace since 217. But it had never been satisfied with an arrangement that restricted expansion and raiding. The Aetolians were receptive. A formal alliance followed, likely in late 211, the first written agreement between Rome and a Greek state. Its logic was transactional. Rome would control the war at sea, Aetolia the war on land. Cities taken by Roman forces alone would be handed to Aetolia, while Rome kept the plunder. In joint captures, Aetolia would gain the territory and the booty would be shared. Operations were limited northward to prevent Aetolian raiders from causing trouble in the Adriatic. In practice, Aetolia was unleashed mainly against Acarnania, a region hostile to Rome in earlier conflicts. This alliance was also designed to build a wider coalition. Sparta, Elis, Illyrian leaders such as Skerdalidas and Pleuratus, and the wealthy king Attalus of Pergamum were drawn in, extending Rome's network into the Aegean and even toward Asia Minor. For Rome, these terms were generous for a reason. The state could profit from spoils while avoiding the burden of occupying Greek cities with Roman troops desperately needed in Italy. Greek allies would do much of the fighting. For Aetolia, the bargain promised a chance to recover losses from the social war and to reopen ambitions that peace had shut down. In the longer term, it offered a route toward dominance in Greece, so long as Rome did not claim that dominance for itself once Aetolia became dependent on Roman help. Philip reacted by raiding Roman-held points and securing borders, but the alliance did its job by forcing him to divide attention. When Aetolian forces massed against Acarnania, the local population prepared for catastrophe. Civilians were evacuated, and those who remained swore to fight to the death. They also begged Philip for aid. Philip rushed south, and even the rumour of his approach caused the Aetolians to halt their invasion. The Roman strategy was working. Philip was being pulled away from Illyria to protect the cohesion of his Greek partnerships. In the following years, most of the states invited into the coalition joined, though motives varied. Sparta's choices were shaped by rivalry with the Achaeans. For Illyrian leaders, joining Rome's side was natural self-preservation. Macedon, still simmering after harsh treatment, broke away and aligned with Aetolia. Elis followed old friendships. Attalus joined for his own reasons, long ties with Aetolia, rivalry with neighbouring Bithynia, and limited options for expansion elsewhere. He also offered what the coalition most needed: ships in the Aegean. Philip's naval weakness mattered. While he worked to rebuild, he could do little against Attalus at sea, or against the Romans and Illyrians in the Ionian and Adriatic. Rome's plan leaned heavily on maritime superiority, using fleets to seize coastal points and pressure supply routes. Despite that advantage, the coalition's results were limited. Small gains were often reversed. Attempts to take key positions produced partial successes and setbacks. Some ports and towns were seized, plundered, and handed to Aetolia, their inhabitants sold into slavery to finance operations and reward allies. Philip, meanwhile, moved rapidly along land routes, securing corridors and threatening passes that had long controlled access into central Greece. Roman fleets reached farther east than before, even taking islands and transferring them to allies in accordance with treaty terms. Those allies then sold assets to secure Attalus's continued participation, offering incentives that revealed how fragile the coalition could be. A notable moment came when a Carthaginian fleet entered Greek waters, likely aiming to compensate for Philip's weakness at sea and to challenge Roman control of the Ionian. The Romans refused battle and stayed protected in harbours, applying the same logic of restraint that had eventually worked against Hannibal. The Carthaginians could do little and withdrew, and later proved unable to coordinate effectively with Philip. Rome may have initially overestimated how dangerous the Philip-Hannibal partnership could be in practical terms, even if it remained terrifying in theory. By 209, Philip, edging closer to key routes, showed willingness to entertain peace proposals from neutral states. A truce was arranged and meetings were planned. Yet the negotiations turned into theatre. Roman naval power hovered nearby, stiffening Allied resolve. Demands were made that were extreme for a side not clearly winning. Then Attalus arrived with forces and ships, and it became obvious that the coalition was not serious about compromise. Plans for a major offensive followed. Illyrian partners harassed Macedon's western borders, while Roman and Allied fleets targeted communications and supply lines. A major thrust was aimed at Euboea, important for Philip's ability to move troops and maintain routes south. But the operation achieved little, because Philip reacted with speed and force. Then, the coalition suffered a blow it could not prevent. Attalus received news that his own territory was under invasion by Bithynia. He withdrew to defend his kingdom and played no further serious role. Philip took advantage, striking hard into Aetolian territory, recapturing lost points and ravaging deep into enemy heartlands. Roman commanders, meanwhile, resorted to punitive raids and slave sales for revenue, actions that damaged relationships but kept operations funded. By 207, momentum favoured Philip. The Achaean League, under a reforming leader, strengthened its army and managed internal stability, limiting disruptions in the south. Neutral states again tried to broker peace. Twice negotiations were derailed by Roman interference. This mattered. Philip's terms were not outrageous, and a purely defensive Rome could have ended the conflict on acceptable conditions. Instead, Rome preferred to continue, partly because prolonging war constrained Philip, and partly because Rome now wanted to punish him. That desire would not disappear even when the war ended without a decisive victory. Philip responded with another rapid strike through difficult terrain, buying passage with territorial rewards and achieving a temporary but dramatic success for his allies. The effect was psychological. It forced Aetolia to confront how alone it might be. Rome had promised support, but Aetolia could not count on major help, when Hannibal still threatened Italy and a new Carthaginian army had arrived in the north under Hasdrubal. Soon Hasdrubal would be defeated and killed at the Metaurus, effectively ending any chance of Carthaginian relief for Hannibal. But that outcome was not yet certain to observers at the time. Aetolia, exhausted, became ready for peace. It had grown tired of serving as Rome's instrument while absorbing the worst of Philip's retaliation. Philip seized the opportunity, shattered the coalition, and imposed conditions that confirmed Aetolia's reduction. Key gains Philip had made in earlier campaigns were retained. Aetolia ratified peace in 206. Rome's position, ironically, was improving in the broader war with Carthage, but when fresh Roman forces arrived in the Balkans, they found the situation already settled. Rome reacted with anger. Its leaders saw Aetolia's separate peace as betrayal, especially because earlier agreements assumed coordination. The Greeks, however, were accustomed to alliances formed and broken according to necessity. Rome had not yet fully absorbed that political culture. Even so, the Romans could do little immediately. A peace conference was arranged through intermediaries, and both Rome and Philip had reasons to accept an end. Philip faced constant threats on his borders, and Rome needed to finish the larger war against Carthage. Philip's agreement with Hannibal, once so frightening, had become meaningless in practice. If its original promises still existed on paper, events had made them irrelevant. The alliance that once threatened to squeeze Rome from two sides had turned into a dead letter, overtaken by shifting realities and the grinding logic of a longer war. The peace agreed at Phoenice in 205 was narrow in scope and focused almost entirely on Illyria. The fighting and bargaining inside Greece had already been settled separately through the Aetolians, so this new deal was about borders, ports, and the hard geography of the Adriatic frontier. Philip gave back Demale and accepted that the Partheni lay within Rome's sphere, but he held on to Lissus. That single decision mattered. With Lissus in Macedonian hands, and with the Atintani still tied to Philip, he kept control of the most important overland corridor linking Illyria with Epirus. As long as relations with Epirus remained friendly, Macedon could still push troops quickly towards southern Illyria when an opportunity appeared. Losing Demale did not cripple Philip because he retained Daceretis and the strategic position of Antipatrea, a key settlement only a short distance east. From a military point of view, it served many of the same purposes as Demale, anchoring control over the interior and the routes that fed the coastal zone. North of this, Pleuratus, now ruling after the death of the old pirate leader Escerdilides, was forced to accept a smaller and weaker realm centered on the northern shoreline, with only a limited base of power. Even though the peace was signed by Philip and Rome, its structure revealed something larger. By this stage, Greek politics was being sorted into opposing blocs. The agreement treated allied states as attached partners rather than bystanders. Alongside the main signatures, lists were added, naming the associates on each side, almost as if the war had already created two informal coalitions that needed to be recognized on paper. On Rome's side stood Attalus, Pleuratus, Sparta under Nabis, Elis, Messenia, Athens and allies, stretching as far as the northwestern edge of Asia Minor. On Philip's side stood Prusias of Bithynia and several major Greek leagues, including the Achaeans, Boeotians, Thessalians, Acarnanians, and the Epirotes. The meaning was hard to miss. Rome was no longer a distant outsider simply meddling at the margins. It was now presenting itself as a rival protector and power broker in the Greek world, facing Macedon on almost equal diplomatic terms. The number of Greek communities looking westward for protection had grown, and their range now stretched across a far wider map. Yet for Rome, this peace felt humiliating. Philip emerged with the larger share of the practical gains, and Rome had not inflicted the punishment many senators wanted. Worse, Rome's first sustained intervention in Greek lands left behind something harder to measure than territory: a reputation. In Greek memory, the Romans quickly became associated with harshness. Several captured towns were plundered, some were sacked, and in more than one case civilians were sold into slavery. Even when mass enslavement was threatened but not fully carried out, the intimidation itself lingered. These actions became stories repeated from port to port and city to city, shaping the way Greeks spoke about the new power that had arrived from the west. What did it actually mean when a Roman army took a town by storm? One ancient account, describing the capture of a major city elsewhere in the Mediterranean, paints a brutal picture of method as well as violence. Troops were unleashed with orders to kill indiscriminately at first, while looting was delayed until commanders gave the signal. The logic was psychological. Terror, not just conquest, was a weapon. In such narratives, the streets fill with slaughter, and the destruction extends beyond people to animals, as if the attackers are demonstrating that the old order has been ripped apart completely. Whether every detail of such descriptions should be taken literally is another matter, but the effect is clear. The image of Roman warfare was built around controlled, purposeful fear. Part of the explanation lies in cultural attitudes that could make surrender seem contemptible, and the defeated seem beneath sympathy. But it would be misleading to treat brutality as uniquely Roman. Greek history itself contains examples just as grim. In the late 5th century, Athens massacred the men of an island community that refused alliance and enslaved the women and children, then planted its own settlers there. Macedon under Philip could act the same way. When he captured a city in northern Greece, survivors were sold, the population was replaced, and even the city's name was changed to stamp the conqueror's authority onto the landscape. What had shifted by the early 2nd centuries was not the existence of cruelty, but its reappearance on the Greek mainland after a quieter period, and the way propaganda amplified it. Depending on political loyalties, Romans could be described as barbaric enslavers, or as liberators rescuing Greeks from Macedonian domination. In practice, the Romans were often more consistent in their harshness, and consistency makes fear more reliable. Philip, despite the favourable balance of the treaty, was unlikely to have been fully satisfied either. His original ambition had been to erase the Roman presence altogether, not simply to push it back. The peace functioned as a pause rather than a resolution. Both sides were discontent, and discontent makes future conflict almost automatic. Philip now held positions at Lissus and in the interior that placed him directly beside Rome's friends in southern Illyria. He was close enough to apply pressure whenever he chose, and close enough to generate constant suspicion. His military prestige had risen again, and the nature of Hellenistic kingship encouraged momentum. Victories created expectations, and expectations demanded more victories. If Philip felt that fortune favoured him, it would be natural to keep moving. The reason peace happened at all was simple. Both sides had more urgent priorities. Rome wanted to finish the war against Carthage and concentrate power where the danger was greatest. Ancient accounts describe Roman concessions as temporary, made to clear the board for the time being. That phrasing reveals the mindset. The settlement was not treated as a final arrangement, but as a delay. Rome withdrew troops at the end of the campaigning season, as it often did, because immediate danger had eased. But withdrawal did not mean forgetting. The memory of being outmaneuvered by Philip remained, and in Roman politics, a perceived defeat was something that demanded future correction. How did Greeks react to this new presence? Before Roman armies landed, Most Greeks had few settled ideas about Rome at all. Mentions in earlier Greek writing were rare and insignificant. Rome had not yet loomed large in the wider Mediterranean imagination. Once Roman forces began operating in Greek affairs, opinions multiplied. Some observers saw a rising imperial power, driven by appetite and dominance. Others viewed Rome as a stabilizing force that could end wars and restrain Macedonian pressure. Many took a more practical stance, cooperating out of caution, calculating that resistance would be punished. Brutality tends to generate two broad reactions: hatred in those who resist, and submission in those who decide survival matters more than pride. This range of responses appears even in Roman correspondence from later decades. Roman commanders sometimes felt compelled to answer the accusation that Rome's actions were motivated by greed. Property was returned to certain communities with careful language about nobility and restraint, as if Rome were trying to control the story it knew would circulate. The need for such statements suggests that suspicion of Roman avarice was already widespread. Curiously, outside historical works, Greek writers seem to have said relatively little about Rome, even during the long decades in which Rome tightened its grip. Much of that literature is lost, so silence is hard to interpret. Still, the fragments that remain point in different directions. One surviving poem from an island poet praises Rome as strength, celebrating it with the language of hymns and destiny. It presents Rome as a power granted lasting rule, almost sacred in its permanence. Around the same period, another Greek voice offers the opposite tone, bitterly remarking that certain distant peoples prosper only because Rome is far away from them. Taken together, the surviving pieces suggest the same spectrum that would be expected. Admiration and flattery on one end, resentment and dread on the other. Roman writers, by contrast, became intensely preoccupied with the encounter. They debated what Greece meant for Rome and what Rome might become through contact with Greek culture. Some embraced Greek art and learning, others resisted it stubbornly. The imbalance in attention makes sense. For Greeks, once Roman power solidified, the choice is narrowed. Accommodation or defiance, alliance or resistance, there was not much room left for detached curiosity. There is also another possibility. A later Greek author felt compelled to argue that Rome was, in some deeper sense, a Greek city, and therefore Greeks should not despise Romans. Arguments like that are not written unless contempt already exists. It hints that many Greeks saw Romans as culturally inferior newcomers, people not worth serious reflection until they became impossible to ignore. Being subdued by outsiders from the West was not only a political shock, but a psychological one. That shock could produce strange stories. One tale, preserved much later, imagines a Roman commander at Naupactus seized by madness or divine possession, delivering visions to an astonished crowd. In the first vision, a king from the east appears as an avenger who will punish Rome for subjugating Greece. To prove the visions are true, the storyteller adds a gruesome sign. A red wolf arrives and devours the Roman leader until only his skull remains, still speaking prophecies of doom. Stories like this are not straightforward records. They are emotional responses, wishful reversals, attempts to regain dignity after defeat, dreams of cosmic justice when real politics offers none. By the close of the First Macedonian War in 206, Rome had gained something it had never possessed before in the Greek world: real influence. Yet, it could not fully exploit it. For the moment, Rome's energy was pulled in other directions, and its authority in Greece survived in uneven flashes through envoys, letters, warnings, and quiet pressure rather than occupying armies. Roman leaders already expected to matter in Greek politics and accepted that this would keep bringing them into conflict with Macedon. What they still lacked was a clear blueprint for turning influence into lasting control. Up to this point, Rome's moves eastward had felt like responses to crises along the Adriatic coast, above all in Illyria, where friends and clients could be threatened and Roman prestige tested. That era of merely reacting was about to end. Once Carthage was defeated and the Second Punic War was settled in Rome's favour in 202, the Republic could finally redirect attention and craft a more forceful line, one that increasingly treated Philip of Macedon as the central obstacle. In the years immediately after the First War with Macedon, complaints began arriving in Rome from across Greece. Some states feared Macedon, some hoped to flatter Rome, and others simply calculated that Roman backing might serve their own advantage. A steady stream of embassies described Philip as dangerous, aggressive, and increasingly unrestrained. The underlying assumption behind these missions was revealing. Many Greeks clearly believed Rome was waiting for another chance to limit Philip, and that only a convincing justification was needed. Roman officials listened carefully. They even sent investigators to gather information and test the truth of the accusations. At the same time, Rome's leaders used morality as a weapon when it suited them. When the Aetolians came early in 201 to ask for help against Philip and hinted at reviving their earlier alliance, they were met with cold indignation. Rome reminded them that they had made a separate peace in 206 and asked how they dared to return now. It was a sharp rebuke, and it landed partly because Rome could claim it was already looking into Philip's behaviour. That earlier investigative step allowed Roman politicians to speak as if they were guardians of principle, rather than opportunists, searching for leverage. Philip, however, gave Rome little reason to relax. He did not slow down. Instead, he acted as if the goal was nothing less than the restoration of a Macedonian empire on the scale once created by Philip II, the father of Alexander. He continued pressuring Illyria and guarded his northern border against the Dardanians, but the most dramatic actions unfolded overseas. In 202 and 201, he launched fast, hard campaigns in the Hellespont and along the northern Aegean shore, capturing key cities and islands until large stretches of the region toward Thrace lay under his power. He also supported his ally Prusias of Bithynia in the seizure of Chios, a move that could only alarm Attalus of Pergamum, whose security depended on limiting Macedonian reach in Asia Minor. Across the Aegean, Philip benefited from a sudden weakness in Egypt's overseas empire. A young king, Ptolemy V, had taken the throne, and court struggles and internal fragmentation left Egyptian garrisons exposed and directionless. Philip moved into that vacuum. He took islands among the Cyclades and cultivated friendships along the coast of Asia Minor, positioning Macedon as a rising sea power again. His successes at sea depended on a rebuilt fleet, and that fleet was financed in part by raids carried out by a pirate leader operating under Macedonian protection. The pirate's theatrics became infamous. He was said to set up altars on foreign shores, dedicated not to gods of victory or justice, but to impiety and lawlessness, as if daring the world to call him what he was. Whatever the story's embellishments, the message was clear. Philip's maritime resurgence had teeth, and it did not pretend to be polite. Just as provocative as Philip's expansion was the way it was carried out. Reports spread of massacres and mass enslavements at places such as Chios and Thassos, followed by the installation of garrisons. These were not subtle acts of influence, they were statements of domination. The cities he seized around the Hellespont had earlier connections with Aetolia, and as Egyptian authority collapsed, many Aegean communities had begun looking to Rhodes for protection. Philip's behaviour therefore threatened not only individual towns but the credibility of other Greek powers. Rhodes was further pushed toward hostility because Philip encouraged Cretan piracy at sea, while Rhodes was already fighting pirates that endangered its trade lifelines. By 201, Rhodes declared war. Attalus soon joined, and the conflict widened. Philip did not retreat. He placed garrisons on major Cycladic islands, seized an Egyptian fleet, sitting in the harbour of Samos, and then moved against Chios, putting the city under siege. A joint Rhodian and Pergamene force tried to break the siege. Philip fought them off, though at significant cost, then turned his attention toward Pergamum itself. He defeated a Pergamene army in the field, but the city held. He plundered supplies, refilled stores, and resumed operations along the Asian coastline. Rapidly, large parts of Caria and much of the mainland zone controlled by Rhodes were reduced into something like a Macedonian overseas possession, administered under a governor. A Rhodian fleet challenged him again near the island of Lyde. Philip repulsed it and sailed onward to Miletus, which offered no resistance. The speed of his progress was striking, and it was enabled by the fact that Egypt was paralysed by internal troubles, while Antiochus of Syria chose not to intervene. A stronger Pergamum was not in Antiochus's interest, since it held lands he believed should be his. Philip then added more coastal footholds by taking Iasus and Bargilia, multiplying the safe harbours available to his fleet. Yet this success created a moment of vulnerability. The Rhodians managed to block him in the Gulf and forced him to winter there, short of supplies and under pressure. Ancient observers describe him enduring the season in a desperate state, as if living by predatory instinct, scraping for food and seething at the knowledge that his enemies were preparing their next moves. In the spring of 200, he slipped away through deception and escaped back to Macedon, with Rhodian and Pergamene forces pursuing. It was the third time his enemies had tried to trap him, and the third time he had wriggled out. No sooner had he returned than he was drawn into a clash involving Athens and Acarnania, a Macedonian ally. Relations between the two had worsened after a religious incident that ended in executions, and older tensions had never disappeared. Athens maintained friendly links with Egypt, and Philip's gains in the northern Aegean threatened Athens' grain lifeline through the Hellespont. Philip responded by sending ships. A combined Macedonian and Acarnanian fleet ravaged Attica until a Pergamene and Rhodian force arrived from Aegina and drove them off. Athens could do little militarily. Its retaliation was symbolic and political. It cursed Philip in formal language and revoked honours once granted to earlier Macedonian rulers. Athens was no longer the imperial heavyweight of earlier centuries. It was increasingly a cultural centre rather than a strategic one, proud of its status but unable to impose its will. While Athens struggled, Philip continued the northern campaign with his main forces. Many towns surrendered, but Abydos resisted. It was a key Egyptian possession on the southern shore of the Hellespont, controlling one of the main crossings between Europe and Asia, and it had been reinforced with Rhodian and Pergamene troops. Philip laid siege. Attalus moved his fleet to the island of Tenedos near the Hellespont's entrance, but avoided direct confrontation inside the strait itself. By late summer 200, the long-awaited wider war was poised to ignite. During the previous winter, when Philip had been trapped at Bargilia, envoys from Rhodes and Pergamum arrived in Rome. They had tried and failed to contain Philip alone. Now that Carthage had been defeated, they believed Rome could finally respond. Along with the familiar warnings that Philip's surge threatened Roman interests, they carried an alarming report. Philip had allegedly reached a secret understanding with Antiochus of Syria, designed to exploit Egypt's weakness. The situation in Egypt offered a rare opening for both kings. Philip aimed to build an overseas empire of his own, and the exposed Egyptian garrisons in the Aegean and Hellespont were tempting targets. Antiochus, returning from successful campaigning in the east, wanted to recover Coele Syria and press claims across Asia Minor, and he preferred Philip to stay out of his way. An approach from the Egyptian court proposing a marriage alliance with Philip only made Antiochus's interest in an agreement more urgent, because it threatened to unite Macedon and Egypt. The arrangement described by the envoys was not a grand romantic alliance, but something more practical. A pact of non-interference, allowing each king to carve into Ptolemaic influence where he wished. Their movements suggest coordination. While Philip campaigned along coastal carrier, Antiochus expanded inland without clashing with him. When Philip was trapped at Bargilia, he even seems to have received supplies through channels linked to Antiochus. Under this umbrella, Philip struck Egyptian possessions and Antiochus launched the war that would finally secure Coele Syria for himself. News of such coordination helped push Rome toward a decisive step, but it did not create Roman ambition from nothing. By this point, Rome had already accepted that its future was tied to the Greek world. Roman inactivity after 206 had been a matter of priorities, not lack of interest. Once Carthage was beaten, the Republic had room to act. The Senate chose to treat events in the Aegean not as distant drama, but as a threat with long-term consequences. It could have ignored Rhodes and Pergamum and confined itself to guarding Illyria and a small circle of clients. Instead, it chose to enter a volatile arena where intervention would inevitably pull Rome deeper into Eastern politics. That decision linked the Western and Eastern Mediterranean in a new and permanent way. It was a turning point, yet it was also a continuation. The Senate could sustain policy across decades when it wanted to, despite the annual churn of offices. It had pursued long campaigns against the Celts of northern Italy with persistence, and now it showed similar determination to preserve and expand influence in Greece. All it needed was a respectable excuse. A resurgent Macedon provided one. Even then, the Roman people did not rush eagerly into another war. When the Senate first presented the proposal, the popular assembly rejected it. The reasons were practical and persuasive. The recent war had left obligations in Spain, unrest in the Po Valley and devastation in southern Italy that demanded rebuilding. Rome faced financial strain and debts to those who had funded the struggle against Hannibal. Launching a major expedition across the sea looked expensive and unnecessary. The Senate's response was not to accept the verdict, but to reverse it. One of the consuls for 200, Publius Sulpicius Galba, was tasked with persuading the assembly. He argued that Philip was not a distant problem but a future danger, as threatening as the names that haunted Roman memory. If Philip were not confronted in Greece, the fight would eventually come to Italy. Whether this fear of invasion was sincere or a political instrument is difficult to judge. In any case, Galba's message combined with the Senate's confidence. The people had watched the Senate steer Rome through the Hannibalic crisis and were inclined to trust its insistence that this new war would also benefit the Republic. The Senate's determination was so strong that it moved ahead even before the final vote had been secured, assigning a fleet to Marcus Valerius Laevinus and sending him toward Illyria to stabilize supply routes and prepare the ground. To win support, the Senate also made concessions. It avoided overburdening war-weary veterans by recruiting heavily from those with shorter service obligations, while still accepting volunteers. And because immediate repayment to wealthy lenders was impossible, it offered land instead. much of it available through confiscations and post-war control. These measures helped soften resistance. The Assembly ultimately approved the Senate's decision, and Galba was instructed to issue a formal declaration of war upon arrival with the army in Illyria. At the same time, Rome began testing the Greek world more directly. Even before the final decision for war, a small commission was sent to travel through key regions, gather intelligence, and shape alliances. The men chosen for the task were not minor figures. One had helped defeat Hasdrubal at the Metaurus. Another had been present at the end of the earlier war with Macedon. The third was a rising statesman whose reputation would later become immense. Their journey was vast, lasting months and covering thousands of kilometers by land and sea. Everywhere they went, they were hosted by local elites, a detail with long-term consequences. Hospitality created relationships, and relationships split communities into factions. Those who welcomed Roman involvement and those who feared it. That social fracture would become one of Rome's most effective tools in Greece. The commission moved south from Illyria, meeting leaders in Epirus, Athemania, and then the major Greek leagues. Their message was blunt and consistent. If Philip would stop attacking Greek states and compensate those he had harmed, peace was possible. If not, war would follow. This was not merely advice, it was a claim of authority. The promise of Roman protection was being extended, beyond a small circle of allies, to the Greek world at large. Rome was presenting itself as the guardian of the whole system, casting Philip as the destabilizer. Given Philip's recent raids and seizures, many Greeks welcomed anyone willing to restrain him, and few chose to remind the Romans of earlier Roman brutality. Polite diplomacy often depends on selective memory. The same words could feel different depending on the audience. To Philip's traditional partners, the message was a warning and an invitation to step back or switch sides. Rome was trying to weaken Philip's Greek alliance by drawing neutrals away and unsettling his friends. To those already inclined to oppose Macedon, the message came with promises of advantage. Everywhere the envoys went, they gathered accusations against Philip, encouraged anti-Macedonian factions, and quietly assembled the foundations of a coalition. For Greek states, this created a terrible dilemma. Choosing the wrong side could mean ruin. Political leaders could be killed, exiled, or replaced. Armies could occupy cities, trade could collapse, farmland could be seized. Violence could follow. Homes burned, public buildings stripped, families broken by assault, men dragged into slavery or mutilation. The threat did not always need to be spoken aloud. Greeks had already seen what both Rome and Macedon could do. The Commission's calm language carried an unspoken edge, and that edge was understood. Their meeting with the Achaean League was especially sensitive. A powerful figure within the League had been pushing for gradual independence from Macedonian oversight, and the Achaean army had been reshaped into a more disciplined force capable of standing on its own. The League had been Macedon's main support in Greece for years, and Philip needed it. Rome's envoys likely hoped to nudge the Achaeans from neutrality toward a stance more favourable to Rome, or at least to prevent them from acting decisively for Philip. Whether that effort succeeded would only become clear later. From there, the Roman delegates reached Athens as the crisis intensified in the spring of 200. Attalus and Rhodian representatives were already present, having just forced back Acarnanian attackers. The Romans did not need to take centre stage. Their presence alone carried weight. Attalus and Rhodes persuaded Athens to join their war against Macedon. Athens could not fight Philip alone, but as part of a larger grouping, it could participate without bearing the full burden. After decades of neutrality, it declared war again. A coalition began to form around Athens, Rhodes, Pergamum, and other threatened powers. As these political moves unfolded, Macedonian forces under a commander named Nicanor appeared outside Athens, continuing raids and devastation. The Roman envoys requested a meeting. This encounter was improvised, but the message was the same as everywhere else. If Philip stopped attacking Greek cities, relations could remain peaceful. If he continued, Rome would respond with war. Nicanor withdrew and carried the warning back to Macedon. Philip's answer was defiance. He sent a smaller force to keep raiding Athenian lands from nearby bases, while he pressed onward toward the siege at Abydos. He had no intention of accepting Roman instruction. Leaving Athens under the practical protection of Attalus, the Roman envoys continued to Rhodes. Even there, unity was not absolute. Some voices preferred accommodation or at least an end to war. Delegates from other Greeks tried to influence that faction. Roman pressure stiffened Rhodian resolve, and the pro-compromise approach was rejected. Rhodes also served as a stepping stone for Rome's first deliberate reach beyond the Greek mainland. The envoys moved toward meetings with the young Egyptian king and with Antiochus of Syria. Rome aimed to keep Egypt friendly and to persuade Antiochus not to join Philip's cause. The effort appears to have had real effect. Antiochus soon redirected his campaigns away from a direct assault on Egypt itself and toward other targets, suggesting that Rome's diplomatic weight was already being felt in the wider Eastern Mediterranean. It was the first time Rome mediated between major Greek powers on this scale, and the first formal contact with Antiochus, marking an outward expansion of Roman political reach. When news arrived that Abydos was under siege, one envoy went ahead alone to meet Philip. The message delivered there was sharper. Philip was told to stop attacking not only Greek states but also Egyptian possessions, and to compensate Rhodes and Pergamum for his aggression. In other words, he was expected to treat Rome's preferences as superior to Macedon's long-established position. For Philip, that was impossible to accept. Macedon had shaped Greek politics for generations. The idea of taking orders from a Western power that did not even speak Greek was an insult to status as much as to strategy. The meeting grew heated. A Hellenistic king was not accustomed to being spoken to like a delinquent by a young foreign envoy. But the envoy was not there to debate. He was there to deliver an ultimatum. Philip ended by pointing to the treaty still technically binding both sides, and warned that if Rome chose war anyway, Macedon would defend itself fiercely, trusting in divine favour. It was a risky stance. Philip must have known that Rome was now relatively free to focus resources and could return in greater strength than before. That he still chose open resistance shows how determined he was and how deeply he believed the contest was not only about territory, but about who had the right to decide the political order of Greece. War was now unavoidable, and Lepidus turned back toward Rhodes to regroup with the other envoys before returning to Rome. On paper, the mission looked like a success. The rumoured understanding between Antiochus and Philip had lost its force, and Antiochus was not expected to step in when Rome moved against Macedon. The fighting between Syria and Egypt had been brought to a stop without Egypt needing to summon Roman help. Across the Greek world, several states seemed ready to lean toward Rome, actively or quietly. Pergamum, Rhodes, Byzantium, and Athens looked like the first pieces in a longer chain that might fall the same way. The Senate could therefore focus on Philip, who had received the warning and clearly understood what it meant. In reality, the clock had already moved on. By the time the envoys were sailing home, Rome had already chosen war. The Second Macedonian War had begun. As Galba prepared to cross into Illyria, the siege of Abydos was ending in horror, with inhabitants choosing death rather than submit to Macedonian rule. Philip returned to Macedon in November 200 and found the situation transformed. Roman troops had already appeared in strength. A large army was established around Apollonia, and a substantial fleet was positioned at Corcyra. In response to appeals from Athens, a squadron was dispatched east under Gaius Claudius Cento to challenge the raids being carried out from Macedonian bases near Corinth and Chalcis. Claudius moved with speed and confidence, and his timing carried real risk. Winter sailing in the narrow, turbulent waters around the Euripus Strait was dangerous even for experienced crews, yet he pressed on anyway. He struck at Chalcis with an aggressiveness that nearly produced a dramatic breakthrough. The problem was manpower. He could punish the place, but he could not both hold it securely and guarantee Athens' safety at the same time. So he withdrew. Even so, the operation mattered beyond its immediate damage. It was a symbolic blow, and it carried practical consequences. A garrison was wiped out, a major granary was burned, and an arsenal filled with valuable siege equipment was destroyed. Chalcis was not just any city. Along with Corinth and Demetrius, it was considered a key lock on Greece's internal movement and supply routes. Whoever controlled these strong points could shape much of the traffic through the Greek world. They were usually defended so heavily that complacency could take root, and that complacency was what allowed Claudius to slip inside. Philip responded quickly. He re-established the garrison at Chalcis and launched an assault on Athens that was only narrowly beaten back. Then he left the harassment of Athens to his local commander Philocles and moved south to the Peloponnese, where he attended a meeting of the Achaean League. The timing was not accidental. Philip knew the Achaeans were wavering, and he understood how much he needed them. He offered a bargain. He would take over their war against Nabis if they would hold key strongpoints, Corinth, Chalcis, and Aureus, so his rear would be secure while he advanced. The Achaeans refused. They chose to keep handling the Spartan conflict themselves, rather than bind their fate even tighter to Philip. For Philip, this was a warning sign. He could no longer assume the Achaean League would stand with him when the real pressure arrived. He made one more attempt later, dangling incentives and territory, but the trust was cracking. He returned to Macedon for a winter that must have been filled with preparations, anxiety, and hard choices. While Philip was still on the road home from Abydos, Roman forces were already active inland from the Adriatic. Galba established a base in Illyria and began pushing raids into the interior to shape the battlefield for the coming season. His deputy, Lucius Apustius, moved aggressively, taking a series of strongpoints and striking into Daceretes, with little immediate resistance. Then he turned on Antipatrea. Negotiation failed. Force followed. The town was stormed, men of fighting age were killed, the settlement was stripped clean, and then it was burned. No attempt was made to hold it. This suggests the aim was not occupation but clearance, opening routes for deeper operations and denying Philip a useful foothold. Antipatrea would not truly revive for centuries. For Macedon, the event was an obvious gift, proof, repeated again, that Rome's presence came with a harsh edge that could be turned into propaganda. News of early Roman momentum drew hesitant players to Galba's camp during the winter. Pleuratus came to pledge support. A leader from the Dardanian world arrived as well, offering cooperation. Galba urged them to be ready when the campaign moved toward Macedon in spring. Amminander of Athemania also appeared, having decided after the previous year's diplomacy that his safest course was to side with Rome. Because Amminander had ties with the Aetolians, Galba used him as a channel to try to bring that league back into the war. The Aetolians, still resentful after being brushed off earlier by Roman officials, hesitated. Their caution may have been costly. There were signs that Galba imagined a larger plan: pressure from the northwest, through Illyrian and Dardanian forces, pressure from his own army advancing from the west, and perhaps a third thrust from the southwest if the Aetolians moved through Thessaly. Without that third component, the design was less dangerous to Philip. Modern audiences often expect disciplined armies to avoid plunder, with only minor theft happening at the margins. That expectation is relatively recent. In earlier centuries, looting was common after great battles and major occupations, and even well into the modern era, armies could sack cities. To understand the ancient world, it helps to return to a harsher baseline. Plunder was not only tolerated but expected. Winner takes all was a rule of war. For many soldiers, the promise of loot was one of the main reasons to fight at all. In Roman warfare, the system was organized. Booty taken in the field was gathered and then redistributed according to rank. Officers and cavalry received more than foot soldiers. After a successful campaign, a cash reward might follow, sometimes enough to allow a man to return home and purchase land. The state benefited as well. Captives could be sold or ransomed, livestock auctioned, and human beings turned into money for the treasury. Victory was supposed to refill public finances, not drain them. Back in Italy, much of what was taken from private houses ended up in private Roman houses. Smaller artworks were bought by collectors. Homes of the wealthy filled with statues and paintings, often in styles admired from the Greek world. At the same time, a portion of the most prestigious objects, especially public monuments, was redirected into the religious and civic heart of Rome itself. This was where plunder became more than profit. Many of the monuments seized from Greek communities had been sacred focal points, tied to local identity and worship. Removing them destabilized the community's sense of itself. Rededicating them in Rome, even when framed as reverence, was also a statement of hierarchy. When a famous image of a Greek god was installed in Rome in a temple associated with the Roman equivalent, the symbolism was blunt. The favor of the divine order and the right to display it was shifting westward. Plunder could therefore serve as both punishment and propaganda, an imperial language spoken in marble and bronze. Over the long run, the value of this official booty from the Greek world became enormous, and the pieces that reached Italy included works that later generations would have called priceless. Famous paintings and sculptures circulated as trophies. Triumphs displayed them publicly as proof of domination. Some commanders paraded hundreds or even thousands of statues through Rome's streets, and Italian towns beyond Rome also filled with Greek art. For the conquered, this was not simply economic loss. The humiliation was moral. A city's monuments carried memory and pride, and their removal signalled that the community's story could be rewritten by outsiders. On the operational side of the war, Philip's major weakness remained the sea. In 199, Rome and its allies used their naval edge to strike where Philip could not respond quickly. His fleet was pinned near Demetrius by Rhodian pressure, and Roman ships ranged widely, plundering coastlines and islands until the holds were so full of loot that the ships could scarcely take more. Yet even in this moment of dominance, they made few permanent gains. One major exception came late in the season as they were sailing back toward winter quarters. They captured Aureus, an important strategic prize. Responsibility for the town was handed to Attalus, while Roman forces profited by selling the inhabitants into slavery. The pattern was familiar: limited territorial control paired with immediate financial extraction. On land, Rome's progress was also limited. With the Aetolians still not fully committed, Galba attempted to pressure Macedon from multiple directions. Illyrian and Dardanian forces pushed in from the northwest, while Galba advanced along the Apsus Valley and then tried to cut east through difficult mountain routes south of the Prespa Lakes. It was a hard march through terrain that favoured ambushes, skirmishing, and small cavalry clashes rather than decisive set battles. Philip acted quickly. A force under one of his generals moved north to contain the Illyrians and Dardanians, while Philip himself confronted Galba. The Romans fought their way into regions that brought them uncomfortably close to Macedon's heartland, performing better than Philip expected, enough to force him to pull additional troops down from the north. Eventually, Galba was pushed back. Still, the campaign had value. Routes were tested, local allies were activated, and the next attempt would begin with better knowledge. Galba, however, was worn down. Illness and exhaustion ended his command, and he was replaced later in 199 by Publius Villius Tapulus. Villius arrived to find a dangerous problem: near mutiny. Many veterans had served abroad for years, repeatedly extended, separated from families, without respite. Villius listened rather than threatening. He promised to carry their grievances to Rome. The tension eased, and Rome kept the experienced backbone of its army intact. Villius then moved to winter quarters on Corcyra, and the front quieted until spring. The most significant political effect of Galba's pressure was felt among the Aetolians. Hearing that Macedon was being invaded from the north and that Aureus had fallen, they began to believe Philip's collapse was imminent. They finally showed their hand, launching a disorderly raid into Thessaly together with Amynander. The move was badly timed. They failed to coordinate with the Roman army, and Philip struck them hard. At the same time, his northern commander managed to chase the Dardanians back out of Macedon. By the end of the year, nothing had been decided. Rome had inflicted damage and gathered allies, but not delivered a knockout. Philip had absorbed multiple pressures and still kept the war from turning into disaster. The struggle remained open, tense, and unfinished, exactly the kind of war that could drag on until one side found the leadership, the luck, or the coalition strong enough to force a conclusion.